So good morning, it's Kristen Forster, back after a little bit of a break doing Crumbs Under the Table. There wasn't a kind of a strategic reason, it's just one of those things that kind of happened. There were lots of rainy days, so I wasn't kind of broadcasting them. And then also some of you have noticed the last kind of handful of broadcasts I did that went out on Facebook but never made it to YouTube because they were just constantly losing signal and dropping out. So I'm kind of praying that today I'm going to maintain a signal right the way through this through this broadcast. Some of you will be aware that the last few days 3 was totally down. They're my network provider. And I'm hoping that all the dropout I was getting was the kind of the run-up to them having their major network problems and are now sorting those things out. So anyway, here I am. Let me turn the camera around so you can prove that the dogs are with us. Actually, I can't see on my screen because the sun is right in my eyes. There we go. It's just up there. You can see. Anyway, there's Banjo over that way, and Luna. You may just about be able to pick out her tail. Luna, come on, Luna, come up here. Is she coming? Yep, here she comes. Anyway, I was looking at reading Psalm 4 this morning. I'm going to see how much of it I can remember. I'm just going to do the first 4 verses because I can't have it on the screen of my phone at the same time as I'm talking to you. But I just thought actually how incredibly subtly layered some of those psalms are. And it starts in that. It starts. I was going to say that wonderful way, but I'd probably say that about an awful lot of verses. It just says, "Answer me, O God of my righteousness." And as is often the way in ancient languages, it's ambiguous whether it's a command or a request. In modern English, it's often the way it's still in modern English. So that's why we have exclamation marks, which make it a command, or a question mark, which make it a request. Will you answer me, please? But the psalm just starts in that, and there's something in that I find kind of wrapped up in the whole tenor of the psalm. There's something just in the way in which the language works, which kind of implies a kind of an element of grace, which sometimes I miss. So nowadays I use the word God's accommodation of us, which in one sense is not as rich as the word grace, but it just somehow for me sometimes draws out this little nuance in the sense of when someone offers grace, if you think of grace as the gift, the cost of the gift is in the person who gives it, and so there's grace from the giver. So in the giver, grace means the cost that is incurred to them to give this gift. When it's the gift, it's grace, and when it's received by someone, of course, it imparts value. If they receive it, it gives them value, and we're very conscious of that layer of grace. It's the value that God puts into me. And I'm conscious of it. I'm conscious of it because I receive the value of it. But I'm often struck by how much there is of God's accommodation, which is another form of grace. And perhaps the difference there is that we have no idea, if you like, of the cost to Him to accommodate us. And I kind of get some of that in that opening statement of Psalm 4, which is, "Answer me, O God of my righteousness." Is it a question or is it a request? And who am I to be demanding of God? Paul puts it that way. Who are you to demand of God? But he does so with a great irony, because of course the point is we can. The point is we do. And there's a kind of almost a tongue-in-cheek. He understands that, if you like, the foundation of that question assumes something of God's graceful accommodation of who we are. And increasingly, I find, without wanting to be too kind of complex in this psychology or theology of it, whatever the right term is, I find it incredibly uplifting to understand how much of God's grace hits me that I'm just not really aware of. I somehow just think is natural. It's what I ought to have. And seeing that, of course, helps me love Him more, even though I can't tell you, because almost by definition I don't get how much it costs Him to give it to me. So how much He is accommodating me in those ways. But one of the things that is nice in the thing is there is a kind of a vague understanding of this kind of almost invisible layer, because the guy says, "The God of my righteousness." So he somehow recognises the psalmist somehow recognises that his own righteousness is actually tied up in his relationship with God. And actually that's a profoundly deep and true thing. It's kind of like the only really important freedom we have is cooperation with the Spirit, our spirit with his spirit. So in other words, our cooperation with God is the only real freedom we have that can make any big moral difference. We try and do goodness on our terms, and it never quite works out the way we intended. So there is always got to be something where if I have any righteousness, it is tied up to the relationship I have, a relationship that's made possible because he accommodates me and allows me to come in with my demanding questions. Answer me, God. And then it says, relieve my distress. That's the World English Bible. I checked it in the King James as well. Which I think it had, what was the word it used there? It was strengthen me or something like that in my... But relieve me in my distress. And as I was reading that, I was thinking, in the modern world, we and it's not just true here; it's been around for a good long while. We talk about distress and eustress, and stress could be either. And what's really interesting is the difference between the two is almost always something to do with a mental attitude. Almost always, I say. I know you can come up with an extreme situation and say, would anybody not feel distress in this context? Yes, of course, there'll be some things. But actually, for most of us, we live in basically fundamentally a good world. We can catastrophise as much as we like and say how terrible things are. Democracy is dying in our country. But of course, the majority of history hasn't lived with democracy. And it might be. But there are all sorts of good people who do good things. And even when things are going bad and I've lost a job, we have a very supportive and loving society nowadays, and so there's lots of things to be grateful for, and time again you find that one of the key things are people who are able to lead themselves, and very often leading themselves has a spiritual dynamic to them. It certainly does for me. I absolutely know that if I'm going to move out of a situation where I'm feeling a stress in a situation, a distress in a situation, to a place where I'll still feel stress, but it can now be what we call eustress, which is got opportunity in it. And actually it turns out that it's impossible to have emotional well-being without eustress. We need obstacles to overcome. Being an overcomer is actually good for our psychological well-being. It's why God uses a word in Genesis 1. It says you have dominion over the earth, which means that you'll win in the struggle. Because humanity is actually made to enjoy a certain degree of struggle. So there is, if you like, there's a physical, biological component to stress, but there's something spiritual or mental that we bring to it, and it can change and transform it. It doesn't change the outward circumstances, but somehow changes us in there. And I love that in the beginning of this Psalm 4, verse 1. So, answer me, O God. So I've got that kind of relationship with you, the God of my righteousness. Actually, if I've got any righteousness, it comes out of this relationship. Relieve me in my distress. Give me something in the world differently. Those common experiences when the world is kind of catastrophizing around me and everything looks ridiculous, and you kind of sit down, somehow but God is with me, and that's a good thing. And then in that context, the next verse the focus changes, and now it's like God answers, and he says, oh, you men, you people, you sons of humanity, how long am I going to put up with you turning my glory into dishonour? Nice and friendly. Let's film this dog reaction and see how it goes. Have you seen the other dogs coming, Loons? Good morning. Morning. There he goes. Anyway, so God says, so how long am I going to put up with you? You turn my glory into dishonour. And I think I find it very profound within the situation Europe finds itself in. In fact, the Western world that has had incredible glory from its Christian heritage. And all the flaws of Christendom, there was a leavening of Christ that goes on into society through it. It produces, if you like, hardwood, Christendom, as well as soft fruit, which is the real faith. And increasingly we've recognised that the fruit has been less, and somehow there seems to be more of the tough elements, and we've actually started to watch, I think, in the West, the kind of crumbling away of an excess weight of Christendom that it can't carry anymore, because spiritually it doesn't have the life. But there is a sense in which part of the reason why nothing is done about that is because there was glory in what grew. But we're seeing God's glory. It was a fruit of something that God did. It's becoming dishonourable and self-serving and venal. And so we live in those kind of times, if I can put it that way. And I apply that across the board. I'm not standing here saying that's all one side of the political debate and not the other side. But then there comes this interesting thing where I can't remember what the next verse is now. I can remember where I want to head to, which is verse 4. That's verse 3, to see if I can remember verse 3. I can't right now, but verse 4, there's a challenge from the Lord, which is, first of all, yes, to stand in awe of his righteousness, and not sin. And so there's a very kind of, I can't remember how verse 3 goes, but there's a very kind of clear sense in which this person who's coming in, who's been accommodated by God, and God has responded and said, but you're coming out of a context which takes my goodness for granted and turns what I've done that's honourable into something dishonourable, and you're part of that. Okay, you know. Oh, and that's right, it talks about what comes next, which is that we're talking about people on all sides, and we sort of accept there's that kind of sense of emptiness and vanity in certain layers of leadership. There's an interesting verse which I'm going to do a study on, but I just picked up recently in Leviticus, where it talks about if people are sinning, and the word if is different in different cases. There are 4 cases and 3 different words for if used. And when it talks about the king or the ruler, the word if, its nuances, that it's likely they will. So with people in good king, this might be a bad spot. That might be the problem. Dishonesty. No, he doesn't. But he does accommodate. That's part of his grace. And actually part of the reason why we have to give grace is where we see he does accommodate, and he even recognises that certain circumstances are much harder and much more likely for people to fail in their moral obligations. So how are we going to do those things? Well, we go back to the beginning in that first verse, which is it's God of our righteousness, God of my righteousness. And so in that context, God says, so gaze on me and don't sin. Stand in awe, but don't sin. And it's only as we take time to rest in his presence, to really contemplate him, to allow him and see his circumstance. And then he says, and then lie in your bed and kind of think about or consider yourself. And in that kind of context, to recognise there are things that I don't hold people account to, because I sort of respond and relate to them. But actually, if I was on the other side of a debate, see, I hold an opinion on things. Because I have a certain narrative which I give weight to, and somebody else can hold a very different conclusion, not because they're an evil person making the wrong choices against my narrative, but they have a just totally different narrative, and they've given weight to that. Now I will never give weight to the narrative they've got, because it's not my history, and to try and pretend it is would just be me faking it, just me being untrue. So I have that perspective, but if I can understand that, if I can see it and understand the accommodation of God, the thing is, he doesn't want me not to be me with my narrative. Of any innate goodness in who I have a relationship that keeps it under the light of God. That actually, even coming into that relationship is not a right, but it is an awesome responsibility. Because God is so accommodating of who I am. And if he accommodates who I am and hasn't forced me to recognise the value of what he's given to me, sometimes it's because it's not his immediate agenda. And we bring, though, our heart and our attitude and how we're going to work and keep it before him. So know me, and may I see it, because I'm taking time to reflect on you and understand it, so that I don't condemn myself for it, but like you, I accept myself for it. That doesn't mean to say it's not going to change, but I understand that actually the way it's going to change naturally to keep my humanity is by this process of me standing in awe of you, and therefore not sinning, seeing more and more of that come through. So those are my thoughts this morning. It's been good to get back, and hopefully when I check the video feed when I get home, we'll discover that that this has all kind of come through okay. So anyway, we've got a couple more dogs coming in, so I'll keep the camera rolling so you can say hi to these as well, and then I'll formally kind of say goodbye for the morning. So, good morning. Good, so I'll turn the camera around to say a proper goodbye. So, lovely sunny day again, no rain, not too much network problems there. I noticed a quick dropout, but only for a second, so hopefully didn't spoil the viewing too much. I will probably try and get these going again, but they may not be as regular as they were through the summer just because of weather conditions and workloads and so on. But look out for the other videos that I'm doing from home at the moment. So I can hardly call myself a YouTube star. I had my first video break 300 views the other day, but I have got 200 videos, all slowly creeping up. So please push the kind of word around. You have to get millions of views before you make a penny, so I'm not doing it to get rich. It's just we work, and I'll probably record sessions on this sitting down, but actually if we understand work as the foundation of service, because we're giving away value, and sometimes we get rewarded for that, and that's good. Then actually we should want to our work should kind of happen before we get rewarded, in one sense, I suppose. Sorry, that sounds very manipulative, doesn't it? I do apologise. But what I'm doing is I want to kind of give away the best of what I think God's put into me, just because it needs to be out there. Not because it's the best thing and everyone should find it, but my prayer is that there'll be people who pick up bits from it, and I get those testimonies back, which is fantastic. So people do come back and say, I watched this, it was really helpful, and that's quite common. And I think that's the thing you're looking for, is you want to put out there stuff that feeds others because you've been fed yourself over the years. So anyway, those are my thoughts for this morning. Please kind of add comments or whatever else, and hopefully see you in the next few days. Bye. I'll turn the thing around. It's a beautiful blue sky, as you can see behind me. Okay guys, we're saying goodbye.